Jakob is my name, and I'm a developer at heart, definitely, but I'm also an entrepreneur. I've started a couple of companies, worked at a couple of startups, and so on, and I'm generally like a crazy person, because I don't think anyone sane would actually keep doing that. So what I'm into anyway is all these startups, and lean, and agile, and XP, and TDD, and pair programming, and all those things, you know it. And you get kind of desperate at times when you want to work 24/7, and there's no one else around, so you start to pair up with whoever's there. And I've been doing like different types of work. I used to work at a big data company in Sweden called BERT, which dealt with a lot of data for being a startup. And then I went on to do kind of a small data startup, where we dealt with very little data instead. I've also done some consulting with a couple of friends for other startups and for VCs and so on. And currently I'm working at a company called Fishbrain, which helps sports fishers to catch more and bigger fish. So you guys look out. And I'm from Sweden. And by the way, how many people here have been to Sweden? Like, very few, like 3 or so. So I guess all of you kind of have an idea of Sweden, and I bet it's a lot like this. Like, everyone thinks we're all like butch men wearing heavy furs and always talking about the fact that winter's coming. But it's not like that. It's worse. It's more like this. So yeah, miserable. And what do Swedes do then? Well, we stay inside. We code. That's something we can do to stay away from the cold. And some people, they do something else that's actually also kind of a passion of mine, which is music. And in the city where I'm from, which is called Gothenburg and is on the west coast of Sweden, we actually pioneered a specific genre of music called melodic death metal. Very Swedish. Like, we have to get this rage, this cold out somehow. So, as you can see, melodic death metal is like an extreme subgenre of heavy metal music. And it's centered around our city. So, I thought before I start, I'd just share some of my culture with you guys. So this is how Swedish people get their rage out. Yeah. So if anyone actually knew what song that was or what band, please tweet it to me and I will be very warm and fuzzy inside. But okay. I'm not here to talk about Swedes or metal or snow or anything like that. I'm here to talk about CSS testing and how it's not just a myth. So the purpose of this presentation is not to show off tons of code and like show exactly what I'm doing in particular, but rather raise the awareness of the tools that are out there, because there are actually quite a few. And also, I want to give you some inspiration to a new workflow which could help you with these things. But before we dive into that, I just want to say something about declarative programming, which I'm sure most of you know exactly what it is. But just to make sure everyone's on the same level, this is one definition of it. And declarative programming is a programming paradigm that expresses the logic of a computation without describing the control flow. So like very functional programming. And how does that apply to us as web developers? Because, I mean, this is our domain. This is what we do. Well, obviously, the like core languages for the web, HTML and CSS, are highly declarative. You can't control how a computation is done. You can only describe what you want to achieve, and then the browser will take care of it, all of it. And that's kind of cool, right? Because then we can't really screw things up. It's made to be exactly what you type in, and you're going to get that thing, and everyone's happy, right? But that's not really the case, because as developers, we keep yelling more, more, all the time. We want better tools. We want more advanced ways of doing things. We want to manipulate everything. So when it comes to CSS, people have, of course, created solutions for that, like preprocessors, like SAS and less, and stylus, and so on. And we add all things like variables and mix-ins and all kinds of reuse and operations and everything to make this language more powerful, to make it do exactly what we want. But the question I want to ask is, are we like really, really making it easier to work with CSS, with these things? Or are we just adding more complicated levels of abstraction on top of what we already have? Because I kind of feel like CSS is a lot about writing. And even these preprocessors, it's a lot about writing. Like, oh, how can I skip these extra characters? And how can I reuse this function so I don't have to type it again? And so on. But we're never really talking about reading. Sure, I mean, it's easier to read code that is shorter, but that's not really the whole picture. So when I look at a code base with a lot of CSS, like not something you've just been working on for a month, but something that is a huge project that has lived for a while, I usually always see the same thing when I like stare through the code, and that's something like this. Like a couple of developers riding away into the sunset, shooting their guns. Like there's no real process. There's no tools to make sure that you have high quality in your CSS. And there are a number of like total anti-patterns being used when it comes to CSS. It's a whole lot easier to just add a new style instead of reusing what's already there, because it's hard to find what you're looking for. You have thousands of lines, and you don't know exactly what classes are intended to do the exact same thing you want to do. And even if you find one that has the same attributes that you want to apply on your DOM element, you cannot be sure that someone else wasn't thinking about maybe adding something to that later or so on. So it's just a lot easier to just add a new class and throw that thing onto your own elements. And just as bad, or maybe worse, unused styles are like rarely removed because there's like almost no reason. You don't know what pages the style might be used on. Maybe the class names are generated dynamically, or and you don't really break anything if you keep them there. They just live on and become like dead code, which you don't really know if it's dead or not. And you have no overview as to how the different styles interact. It's just a flat structure, at least plain CSS is, and you have to read through all of it in order to understand all the ideas. And then, of course, we have all these things like form factors and adaptiveness and responsiveness and these things that makes things even harder. So if you test it in one browser and you see that, well, it's OK if I remove this class, I don't need it, then, well, what happens in all other situations and all other devices and so on? So in my opinion, CSS is like the true write-only language. We say that about languages like Perl or whatever, but CSS is like truly write-only. You can actually get away by just adding new styles with stronger selectors and just putting more shit into your code base. And I looked at Wikipedia. Like, what are they saying about the concept of write-only languages? And it says this: in computer humor, a write-only language is a programming language with syntax or semantics sufficiently dense and bizarre that any routine of significant size is too difficult to understand by other programmers and cannot safely be edited. This is computer humor. This is the life we're living. This is not humor. This is for real. This is exactly what CSS feels like. And if you feel differently, please tell me, because then you know something that I don't. So, code quality. something we all struggle with, right? And when we talk about this, if we let go of CSS for a while, like, what do we mean when we talk about code quality? Well, obviously, kind of the opposite of what I was already saying, but in general, we have this functional quality, like the thing we have created is fit to do what we intended to do. We solved the problem. And the second type of quality is structural quality, the degree to which we have created this in a structured way, in a good way. And that's kind of the problem with CSS, because we can achieve the things we want to, but the way to get there is kind of stupid. And structural quality can be broken down into like reliability, maintainability, size, efficiency, security, and so on. And many of these doesn't really apply for CSS. Size is not that much of a concern, honestly. And efficiency, well, we don't control that even. But the reliability of the code and the maintainability of it, how do we control that in other programming languages? What should we start applying in CSS? And the answer is, of course, rather obvious, because you already know what I'm about to talk about. So tests, of course. We need tests. That's what you do to maintain high quality and make code understandable for other developers. How many in here do actually write tests for your code? And I mean any code, not CSS, but code. Scaringly few. Then a lot of you actually, you have a lot ahead of you. But to me, testing is like the only way to start feeling like this about your program. Like, you get the feeling that you can change anything, move anything, try anything, just be like the master of your code base without losing your mind. And for those of you who are not that into tests, then I just want to look at the typical like test-driven development flow. So the idea is that you write a test that fails. You can do it first, you can do it after you've written your code, but if you're really test-driven, then you do it first. So you write a test to describe something that you want to achieve. You haven't done it yet, but you're describing what you want to do, what you want to achieve. And then when you have that, then you start implementing code that will make this thing work. And when it works, then you can go back and start eliminating redundancy, like optimize your code, remove pieces that are not needed, reuse parts of that with other parts of your code, and so on, and be certain that everything still works. So what about testing CSS then? Because obviously we could start thinking the same way about CSS, but there's one big problem. And that's coming back to this declarative thing, that CSS is not procedural. You can't jack into CSS and change the way it works or test for some particular part of it. You can only go directly from the code that you have written to an actual visual result. The browser does magic in between, and it's not yours to touch. But let's try anyway. Let's do something, because that's what's interesting, right? So I'm going to walk through 4 different approaches quite quickly, hopefully, and then try to summarize what we can learn from looking at those. And 2 of them are quite simple. They're targeted at your code. And 2 of them are more advanced, aiming at testing the actual visuals that you're producing with your CSS code. So, first one. This is like super simple. People don't even think of it as a test. And it's the syntax checks that you can do in your editor, hopefully. Like, you check whether or not the CSS you have written is actually valid. Is this something that works? And it's typically done by a plugin or an IDE or so. And obviously, it just looks something like this. We have some highlighting, and something tells us what's going on. All of you are probably already doing this. And then the second way to check your code statically, to see what's going on, is to use some type of style guides and in a combination with linting. So we specify how we want our CSS to be written, like both syntactically, like where should braces be, how much should we indent our code, and so on, which is kind of trivial, but also semantically, like what kinds of attributes should you not use together, or should you not combine in certain ways to catch like common mistakes or patterns that won't work in IE or whatever. And there are tools for this. For example, this one called CSS lint. It's a lot like a JavaScript linter, but it's for CSS. And you can run it on the web, or you can download it and run it on the command line. I think it's a Node.js implementation. And you can specify your own style guides, or use ones that come with it as suggestions. So the reason why this is good, and I think you should start using, is that it's totally easy to apply. I guess you're already doing some kind of static checking of your code, like you're compiling CoffeeScript, or you're compiling less, and you're doing linting on your JavaScript and whatever. You can just add this step into this. And it prevents common anti-patterns. But the problem, of course, is that it doesn't really test the end result. You can't know if what you're writing, even if it's correct, even if it's exactly the thing that you intended when you wrote this style guide, you can't know that it looks the way you want to. And it's also quite useless without a good set of rules. And the like catch-22 with rules is that unless you know what the problems could be, then you can't write the rules to prevent it. And if you know what the problems are, then maybe you don't need the style guide because you already know what to avoid. So it's more for maybe like junior developers, or when you have a large team where you're not like sharing the same hive mind. So let's jump on to the more like sophisticated technologies. The third one then would be to use screenshots to look at what you're actually producing. So you can compare the look of the site before you do some change and after, and see, did it change the way I wanted, and do some image diff between those to see exactly what happened. And there are a couple of tools for doing this. One particular one is called Huxley, made by Pete Hunt, who's actually here today. And it's a tool for, you use it to record a few steps in your app. Like I click this thing, I enter these things, and so on, and record what it looks like. And then you can play back that later when you've changed something to see, did the right things change or not? And there are similar ones out there as well, like Phantom CSS and so on. But this is actually quite popular, and you can ask Pete all about it. And the good thing about screenshots, of course, is that no change can sneak by. Screenshots are the actual output that we're after. That's pixel by pixel exactly the look of the thing we're creating. And it's totally implementation agnostic. You can use any language, any technology, whatever. Screenshots are screenshots. It's on there. But the negative part, of course, is that it breaks on content changes. Say that you have some element of randomness in your site. You show a quote from a client, for example, on the top, and it loops between a number of different quotes. Maybe it's not the same when you reload. Or you have ads, and the ads are out of your control. You can't change them. So you have to start like looking at particular pieces of your app, and you can't screenshot everything because it's too fragile. But it gets complicated, and you have to start specifying it, and it becomes messy quickly. And it yields lots of false positives. If you start comparing browsers, for example, there are tiny rendering differences that you don't really care about, but that will break screenshots because, yeah, it actually looks a bit different. So you need some way to filter out what of these these diffs are interesting and which of them are not interesting. So quite some challenges there. And I think that's one of the motivations why people ended up doing this fourth thing that I'm going to talk about. And that's comparing styles directly in the DOM. So you walk through the entire DOM, each and every node, and look at what particular styles are being applied to this node. And if it's the same styles before and after a change, then you know that you haven't really changed anything. You can't have broken anything. And you compare these styles that are in there to some expectation then. For example, something you had before, or by writing down, like, I want this thing to be blue. And one tool you can use for doing this is called Hardy. It's written by a German guy called Simon. And it's in a very early version at this moment, but it's quite promising. And he has been working a lot on testing CSS. So I think this is definitely worth checking out. And as you can see down there, it's a Node module, so it's very easy to just install it if you're already into JavaScript, which I guess everyone here is. And the thing you do with it is that you write very high-level specifications of what you want your site to be styled like. Maybe some of you have actually seen Cucumber before. Hands up if you've seen it. Oh, that's not a lot. I think it's more popular in the Ruby community. But anyway, Cucumber is a tool for writing specifications in natural language that you then can process. So you write something like this. Like, given that I visit localhost, then the p tags under section should have the color 68, 68, 68. And this will be checked then by Hardy that this is actually the case. And that's kind of cool. We're writing a test in the same way as we're writing tests for JavaScript or other parts of our application. But it's kind of tedious, right, to test one attribute on one tag with this much text. It would take quite a lot of work to test everything. And also, think about the fact that here we're testing that particular styles are being applied. We don't know what it looks like, so we have no idea if this is really what we want or not. But I'm coming back to this actually, so just to give you an idea of how Cucumber is typically used, since there are a lot of people who are not familiar with it, you usually do something like this, like very high level. You say that this is a test for seeing if the filter for our audiobooks work. So we say that given some audiobooks in our collection, when I visit the list of audiobooks and search for a particular term, like core, then I only see the titles that are matching. And when I remove the filter, then I see all the audiobooks again. So this is a test that you implement then using Cucumber. You can go to the site and read more about it if you're curious. But this is like typical acceptance testing. We're not unit testing pieces of our app, but rather can the user do the things that we expect them to be able to do in our application. So testing CSS using this idea is way more resilient to change than using screenshots, because we're targeting very specific parts of our code. And the tests live on in another way than screenshots, because screenshots are kind of create and throw away. You don't build up a test suite using screenshots, really. So these are saved in your code base. But it's a big, big con to having to write expectations in code, because that's not how you work with visuals. It's more natural to like sit and fiddle in Chrome and try and change those colors and experiment with your margins and so on. It would be madness to write these tests beforehand. Like, I want 5 pixels of margin, and I have no idea what it looks like, but that's what I want. And also, of course, style rules are not the same thing as looks, because the site can still look wrong in different browsers on different platforms than what you intended, and you're not testing that. But But as you hear already, there are a couple of tools that you can use. And they all have different like use cases. Depending on what your problem is, you can pick and choose from all these. And maybe you can use all of them. So this kind of should be good news to everyone, right? This is good. But let me ask you this. How many of you are, in like a serious way, using any of these tools? Hands up. And maybe there's like 2 guys over there. But it mostly looks like this. And why is that? We have tools. Maybe people are just not aware of them. Maybe you had never heard of them before. So that's good. I'm here telling you about them. But if you haven't heard of them, that probably means that people are not that into them. They're not really using them in other places either, because then you would have heard of it. So something is wrong here. And I think, this is my opinion, but I think that CSS is like in between 2 different disciplines. We have the developers who are very strict, where like everything is supposed to be in nice little boxes and possible to describe and dismantle in a very precise way. And then we have the designers who are more about creating. So there's some missing piece here. And what is it? Like, what is it that we have to change to make these things usable? In my opinion, it's about design first, because CSS is just a tool to realize your designs. So we should think, how do we incorporate a design-first perspective into testing what we're doing? So let's look back at the testing circle. When we typically work with tests, we write a test that fails, we implement the code to make it work, and then we start refactoring to make everything great. My suggestion when it comes to testing CSS is that we start by creating the design we want, because that's the purpose of CSS, to have a design. And then, when we have that design implemented in actual HTML, looking the way we want to in at least one browser, in one use case, then we start to ensure the consistency across browsers and devices. And we also look at the compatibility with the rest of our code. Did we break something when we created this new page and added new styles, or is everything else still working? And when we have done that, when we have ensured consistency and compatibility, then we can start eliminating redundancy if we have a way to automatically rerun that step. And this is actually mapping exactly to this. But it's the design that is the test. We need a way to make sure that the design we have created becomes the test. The test is not something of its own. And then implementing the code, that's not about writing your first CSS, making it show up in the browsers. That's about consistency across browsers and compatibility with the rest of your code. Because you all know that, right? Creating a design is not hard, and implementing it in CSS for one browser, in one use case, that's easy. The big job is the laggard browsers, like getting it to work in IE6. Like that's half of the job, at least, and then the mobile devices and everything. So the real work is done in number 2. And then we can think about how do we eliminate redundancies. But we should not do some magic new type of tests before everything. The design is the test. So let's talk about a possible 5th option here. We're thinking about this again. Imagine that we have written something like this. We have a scenario describing exactly what the user can do, and that tests that this is possible. And if you don't have this, then I'm not really sure that you should be worried about whether your site looks right or not, because you have no idea if it's working. So you should start in that end. That's my opinion, at least. So start by making sure your site works, by using Selenium and Cucumber, Capybara, any of those things. And now we have user stories. We have descriptions of all the things that a user can do in our application, so we don't have to do that like manual recording for things we want to test. We already have the descriptions of what we want to test. And now the question that remains is, does it look right during those steps in our test? And how is the computer supposed to know if it looks right? Because even if all the browsers look exactly the same, maybe they all look like shit. So this is creating the test. You have written something, and now you want to say that this is the thing. This is the way I want it to look. This is working. So just imagine that we've created some simple site like this, and we had some plugin or some bookmarklet in our site that we could click on to say that now this is right. This looks like I want it to look. Because you can't let the computer decide if the looks is correct or not. But this browser, at this particular time, with exactly this source code, this is what I want. Now we can shove that away, put it in the cloud, do screenshots, do DOM sniffing, use all technologies there are to capture this state that the application is in that browser. And now we have to start checking other browsers and see if the rest of our app works. Well, that's not that hard, because we already have tools that do that, given that we capture the state, like I told you before. So we could automatically run the same test in all other browsers using Selenium in all versions and so on, and all devices, and see this was not very clear, but we could still get some kind of list saying that in these 4, you have deviations that look very different from what you already have. And we could show them and guide the user to see where are the faults. And since we base the tests on, I'm jumping back now, but on these things, and these are saved, all the scenarios in our applications are stored in our code base. When we run this thing, we will also know if all the other things that we had before are still working the way they used to before we wrote our new code. So now we just have to go through this in kind of the same way that you would do with image diffs, to mark the diffs and say that this change is intended and this change is not intended. And maybe certain deviations that are not intended changes but are rendering differences and so on, you can mark them as OK as well, if you think that it's OK that it looks this way in this browser. And when you've resolved everything, it all passes, everything is green, and the test tool now tells you that everything works. So now you can go to the 3rd step, and you can start moving CSS around, you can start deleting attributes that you think are dead, and so on, and you can see, does this test still pass? Does it produce the same thing? So to kind of get the gist of this, the idea is that design is manual. You can't automate design. You have to create some layout. And the definition of correct, that's also manual. It's in the same way that you're writing your tests in JavaScript, for JavaScript, is manual. Then defining what is the right look, that's also manual. You have to do that yourself. That's your job. But testing changes, that's automatic and can be done using various different technologies that we have further down the stack. So it's about design first and design as tests, not tests as some separate entity. And if we look at the ups and downs for this thing, what's the pros and what's the cons? Well, we're jacking into the acceptance tests that are already there. And that's useful because it means that there are a ton of things that we don't have to set up. We assume that acceptance tests are there, so we can somehow deploy to a staging site. We have a staging environment that we can fuck up completely if we want to. And we have already described all the possible scenarios that the user will go through. And like I said, if you don't have that already, then you have bigger problems, obviously. So this also gives us this thing that we don't need a record step. We already know what kind of steps we want to go through, that we want to test. And there's no convoluted design spec saying in code what the design should be like. But you have looked at the design, at a design, and stated that this was what I wanted. This is the way it's supposed to look. Now, there's one big con to this, and it's that it's make-believe. So this is the actual mythic part of the presentation. To be honest, it's not entirely make-believe, because I've been working on something like this with a couple of my colleagues, but it's split into pieces across a number of proprietary code bases, so it's kind of hard to extract it. We started working on this because we want to make a tool out of this that people can use. But I ended up getting a new job that takes a lot of energy, and I haven't had time to finish this thing. So if we look back at my initial idea, like the purpose of the presentation, I wanted to raise some awareness, and I hope I've done that. You've seen a couple of tools. And you can also look for like their competition if you want to see others. But these are the types of tools, these 4, that are the most popular, at least. And then I wanted to inspire you to this new workflow, a new way of thinking about design and testing that a design is correct. But there's a third thing, and it's the fact that I feel like all these tools are hard to get started with. Testing is hard to begin with, and this type of testing is even harder. But I still feel like we have to get further. We have to create something more and make this more accessible, easier to use for everyone to get started with it. So what I would be really happy for would be for you to kind of join into the discussion. I'm sure a lot of you have opinions about this. You have ideas, you have built things yourselves, you have faced challenges that you think that a tool like this wouldn't solve. Good or bad, all kinds of feedback can be used to take us all like a bit further, to figure out what we really need, what's the next thing. And of course, actually working on it. If someone were to make a prototype that would do something like this, without all the messy code that I already have, I would be more than happy. So this is not my idea. This is an open idea. And you have my Twitter handle. You have the JSConf Twitter handle. You have the chat on the site. We have IRC. Start talking everywhere. Start talking about this thing and see, is this something we really need, or is it just in my mind? And that's all I wanted to say about automated CSS testing. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jakob. And as usual, if anyone has any more questions for Jakob, just raise your hands.
Since we have a couple of minutes extra, I have a tiny favor to ask of you. And since the Wi-Fi is amazing at this conference, it's really great, we should do a little load test. So there's a tiny URL down there, and I see a lot of computers, and I guess a lot of you have smartphones. So if you would use 1 minute to go onto that and answer 3 short questions about this thing, I would be very happy, because it would help us to know whether or not we should pursue this and finish our idea when we find the time, or if it's totally uninteresting.
Hi. I'm just wondering how you'd work this into kind of an iterative design environment. I mean, do you wait till the design is finished and then build all the tests, or are you kind of doing them in parallel with your design as it's changing?
When you say designer, do you mean a person who is just making Photoshop mock-ups, or someone who's actually writing CSS as well?
To me, the only valid web designer is one who can code as well.
Someone who codes as well.
Yeah, it's a coding designer.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the best kind, obviously. That's the one I would work with. So the question was how to work iteratively with that kind of person, like between developer and designer.
Yeah, I guess the thing is trying to reduce the overhead of building the tests alongside the design.
Yeah. Ideally, this would all be something that a designer could use on his or her own. Like, you should not have to think about programming when you do this. That's why, for example, you want to get away from the writing of a test specification and so on. You want this to just be about looking at something and saying, yeah, this is what I want, and now it's correct. And then a designer who's working with CSS, they can obviously already start fiddling with their code and see if things changes and run this again. You don't, as a designer, you don't have to learn anything new to do this thing. You would just have to run this tool whenever you feel like you're finished. Is it now working everywhere, and so on. So I definitely think it would be perfect for working iteratively.
Right, so you just do it after the design is kind of more finalized.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I mean, after, it depends what you mean with after. I would say that creating the design is a small part of the work, and then making it work in all places and with the rest of your code, that's the large work. And you do it both, you do it between those steps, and after the last one as well, for refactoring and so on. So it should be something that you do continuously as soon as you feel like you've designed something that's complete, but you're not sure if it works everywhere else and with the rest of your code.
Okay, great, thanks.